Hollywood Heroes Part 3. So long as you keep watching these videos, we're going to keep making them. There's an endless supply of heroes from film and TV who serve their country. You know the rules. These are folks who served in actual combat, so let's go. Let's start with Michael Caine, one of the most prolific and beloved actors of his generation. His resume is way too long to itemize. He's been in like a million movies, but he's one of those guys that no matter the movie or role, he's always great. We did a short on him, and most people were surprised to learn about his military service. He was born Maurice Joseph Micklewhite, and at age 19, he was drafted into the British Army's Royal Fusiliers, where he was sent to Korea to fight. He was stationed in what today would be known as the demilitarized zone, and he tells a harrowing story in his autobiography about how he and two buddies were ambushed one night while on patrol, and that the Koreans and Chinese threatened to overrun their position. Instead of falling back, the three counterattacked, though outnumbered 36 to 3. "If we die, we'll bloody take out as many of them as we can," Michael Caine barked at the others. I wish I could do that in his accent, but I can't. Somehow, he miraculously survived that evening. Fighting in Korea changed Michael Caine. Going into it, he had been sympathetic to communism, but after fighting the Chinese and seeing up close their human wave tactics, as he called it, he became an ardent anti-communist. He also vowed to get the most out of life and live every bloody moment from the second I wake up until the second I go to sleep. Again, I really need to do that in the Michael Caine accent. Ironically, one of his first acting gigs would come in a movie called A Hill in Korea, which was all about the Korean War. You can't make this up. What a truly extraordinary individual. He's retired from acting now, but his body of work will live on forever. Michael Caine. Charles Schulz, the creator of Snoopy and the Peanuts cartoon. I thought I knew a lot about the Hollywood icons who served in combat, but I have to admit that I was a little surprised by cartoonist Charles Schulz. But I shouldn't be. He's sort of like Rod Serling in that you could sometimes see the impact of the war on his work. In the case of Schulz, the frequent theme in the Peanuts cartoon is loneliness and heartbreak and longing and even sadness. And that's what Schulz experienced himself as part of the 20th Armored Division. He fought throughout France and Germany and took part in the liberation of the Dachau concentration camp and the occupation of Munich shortly before the war's end. He would speculate in his autobiography that the immense sadness that he was feeling while seeing the human devastation of World War II bled into his sensibilities as a cartoonist and was reflected throughout the 50-year run of Peanuts. Schultz's mother passed away from cancer during the war, which made the situation that much worse and lonelier. And he writes that when he returned, his very stoic dad, who was a barber, didn't even bother to stop cutting the hair of a customer to greet him. Can you imagine that? Sort of heartbreaking when you think about it. Peanuts is arguably the most beloved and successful comic strip of all time. And I can't help but think that Charles Schulz's experience during the World War II gave it the tinge of loneliness and poignancy that made it connect with so many people. "The 3 years I spent in the Army taught me all I needed to know about loneliness," he once said. Pretty amazing, Charles Schulz. Peter Falk Columbo, one of the most iconic TV characters of the 20th century, has one of the most fascinating personal stories. For starters, did you know that he had a glass eye? He had eye cancer when he was a child, and he had his right eye removed. Even with one eye, he was a standout athlete in high school, and upon graduation, he desperately wanted to join the Navy to help the war effort. Of course, he was rejected because of his eyesight, but he somehow talked his way into the Merchant Marine and served in the war that way. Now, for those of you who are about to comment about that not being actual war service, there's 2 points that I have to make. First is, in 1988, Congress conferred veteran status on all merchant mariners during World War II. So in fact, it is service. And second, being in the Merchant Marine was one of the most dangerous jobs of the war. They were absolutely critical to supply chains, yet they were defenseless to German and Japanese subs and destroyers. It was really dangerous work. Falk talked his way into service when he didn't have to, and later on in his career, when he hit it big with Columbo, he went out of his way to cast vets, guys like Eddie Albert, Sorrell Booke, and many, many others. Columbo still holds up as one of the greatest shows in TV history, and Peter Falk was truly a stand-up guy. I just love the guy. So Wayne Morris. Wayne Morris is sort of a sad situation. He's not really remembered much at all today, unless you're a devotee of Turner Classics or 1950s B westerns and TV shows. But for a few years in the late 30s and early 40s, Wayne Morris was the it guy of Hollywood, on a similar trajectory to Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart, and the other handsome leading men of the day. In fact, he had only been in Hollywood a short while when he landed the lead role in Kid Galahad, taking top billing over heavyweights like Edward G. Robinson, Bette Davis, and even Humphrey Bogart. He was consistently getting top billing through the late 30s and 40s when he decided to put it all on hold and take a commission in the Navy prior to Pearl Harbor, like his good friend Jimmy Stewart, who also received a commission prior to Pearl Harbor. Wayne was a skilled naval aviator and flew the F-6F Hellcat off the carrier USS Essex with the famed McCampbell Heroes. He was credited with flying 57 sorties and shooting down 7 Japanese Zeros, making him one of the earliest aces of the Pacific Theater, and he received 4 Distinguished Flying Crosses and 2 Air Medals. Wayne Morris was the real deal, plain and simple. His aviation acumen and heroics were right up there with Jimmy Stewart. In fact, there are a lot of parallels between Wayne and Jimmy. Both were big-time stars prior to joining the war effort. Jimmy probably a bigger star, but that's only because he had just won the Oscar for Philadelphia Story. Both were excellent aviators, really top-notch flyers. They both joined prior to Pearl Harbor, and they both suffered pretty severe PTSD after the war. In Jimmy's case, he figured out a way to channel PTSD into being an even better actor, but sadly for Wayne, it led to alcoholism. After the war, Wayne Morris struggled to regain his leading man status and ultimately was relegated to B movies and TV roles here and there. Sadly and tragically, he died in 1959 at the age of 45 while visiting his old wartime commander and watching aerial maneuvers on the bridge of an aircraft carrier off the Monterey coast. Truly heartbreaking, Wayne Morris. Like Wayne Morris, Cesar Romero was also a well-established actor when he put his career on hold to enlist in the Coast Guard. In fact, he was just beginning to transition from character actor to leading man status with the Cisco Kid Westerns when he became a coastie. I find that so badass. These guys who are already stars or on the verge of stardom, and they think nothing of putting their career on hold to serve their country. He was part of the crew of the transport ship USS Cavalier and saw action at Saipan and Tinian, among other places. By all accounts, he won the respect of his shipmates who considered him one of the best winch operators they had ever worked with. Cesar's duties included shifting 18,000-pound barges from the transport ship into the water during assaults and operating as a powderman on the forward gun. He could have easily taken some stateside desk job like many celebrities did, but the guy insisted on seeing combat. Cesar remained a busy actor after the war and scored probably his most famous role as Batman's original Joker in the campy TV 60s show. He famously refused to shave his trademark mustache as the Joker, so they had to apply pancake makeup over it, which I find hilarious. What a stand-up guy, Cesar Romero, a true American original and badass. So here's a name that surprises people, Walter Matthau. We did a short on his World War II service, and aside from Boss Hogg, he got the second most "wow, I had no idea" comments, and I'm not sure why that is, but it is. Walter was not an actor when he enlisted in the Army Air Force. In fact, he was fresh out of high school. He served as a radio man gunner on a B-24 Liberator bomber in the 453rd Bombardment Group out of RAF Old Buckingham, where Jimmy Stewart was the group operations officer. In fact, legend has it that it was a chance encounter between Matthau and Stewart that convinced Walter Matthau to pursue a career in acting after the war. He flew a total of 30 missions over continental Europe and achieved the rank of Staff Sergeant. Now, I've said this many, many times in many videos, but being on a bomber in the 8th Air Force was about the most hazardous thing you could do in World War II. In fact, the 8th Air Force suffered more casualties, 50,000 to be exact, than the entire Marine Corps. And keep in mind, they fought some of the bloodiest battles of World War II. Okinawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Guadalcanal, the list goes on. The death rate among bombers was like 20%. So statistically, you were dead after 5 runs, and Walter did 30. He'd go on to have success in Hollywood, mostly as a tough guy or heavy in the 50s and 60s until he found his niche in comedy and became one of the most prolific comedic actors of the 70s through the 1990s, including one of my all-time favorite movies, The Bad News Bears. A total legend, Walter Matthau. Norman Lear, surprised to see him on this list too? Many of you know that he was a big-time Hollywood liberal. He certainly had a message in the types of shows he created, like All in the Family and Maude, but that shouldn't negate his patriotism and his unbelievable service during World War II. Norman flew a staggering 52 missions as a B-17 radio operator and gunner based out of Italy. Most of those missions were over Germany, which were by far the most dangerous types of runs, especially the daylight bombing runs. Again, keep in mind, bombing missions were among the most dangerous roles in World War II, and he went well beyond the mandatory 30. Also keep in mind that he dropped out of college to enlist in the Army Air Force immediately after Pearl Harbor. He didn't wait to be drafted, he enlisted. Look, irrespective of what you think about his politics or his shows, and there's no denying he was a big liberal and he wasn't above pushing his agenda on his shows, the guy was a legitimate Hollywood badass and a hero during World War II. And I happen to think All in the Family is one of the all-time great sitcoms, and in watching the reruns, it still stands up today. And Norman Lear was a giant of TV and a true American badass. Did you know that Gene Roddenberry flew over 50 combat missions as the pilot of a B-17 Flying Fortress with the 394th Bomber Squadron of the 13th Air Force? Did you also know that Gene earned both a Flying Cross and the Air Medal for missions flown over Guadalcanal in the Philippines, among other places? Well, it's all true. The legendary Star Trek creator flew among the most missions of anyone in the Pacific. Wrap your brain around that for a second. And somewhere along the way, Gene befriended a Chinese pilot whom he credits with helping him learn the finer points of outmaneuvering Japanese Zeros. After the war, he tried his hand at commercial aviation and police work before finally pursuing his passion for science fiction writing. Roddenberry lost contact with his buddy named Kim Noonien Singh, but used his TV show Star Trek to try to find him, naming their most notorious villain Khan Noonien Singh after him. I mean, how cool is that? When decades went by without a word from him, Roddenberry tried again with The Next Generation, naming Commander Data's father Dr. Noonien Song. I just love that. I mean, he never stopped trying, looking for his buddy. Sadly, Gene Roddenberry passed away in 2010, never hearing from his beloved friend, but leaving behind an entire universe of his creation. What an amazing guy, Gene Roddenberry, another icon of TV. So let me take a second to clear up two persistent myths that we get in our comment section about Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, and Bob Keeshan, better known as Captain Kangaroo. We see a lot of comments like, "Hey dummy," referring to me, "you forgot Rogers and Keeshan." Well, we didn't forget about them. The truth is, Fred Rogers never served in the military at all. Somehow, a myth developed that he was a sniper in Vietnam, but it's just not the case. He never had any military experience. And as for Bob Keeshan, Captain Kangaroo, he actually did serve in the Marines, but he was stateside when the war ended and never saw any combat. Now, there's an even weirder urban legend that Lee Marvin, of all people, went on The Tonight Show and talked about Keeshan being a hero at Iwo Jima. Again, that's a myth too. Marvin never said any such thing on any show. In fact, Lee Marvin wasn't even at Iwo Jima. He fought at Saipan in Okinawa. Two really strange urban legends, both false. I'm sure we'll still get comments about it, and I'll just point them to this video. Let's talk about Brian Keith, one of the most beloved actors of his generation, but sadly a little bit forgotten today. He actually made his film debut at the tender age of 3 and appeared in a dozen silent movies during childhood, and over his 7-decade career, he would appear in over 100 films and TV shows, very prolific. Both of Brian's parents were accomplished actors, and his acting career was beginning to really take off when he decided to enlist in the Marine Corps 5 months before Pearl Harbor. Again, another guy before Pearl Harbor. So many of these heroes put their careers on hold prior to Pearl Harbor, which I just find staggering. Brian Keith was a gunner on a Douglas Dauntless dive bomber, where he flew bombing missions to Rabaul through the infamous Valley of Death. Interestingly, his career almost never came to pass, were it not for some quick thinking on his part and help from a Marine Corps legend. During one mission, Keith had 2 zeros hot on his tail when his gun overheated. Out of desperation, he shot double red flares at them, missing his target, but catching the eye of Pappy Boyington, who flamed 1 zero and chased the other off. I mean, pretty amazing. He was saved by the real Pappy Boyington. Too bad Brian never appeared on Black Sheep. Now that would have been cool. And finally, you might not have expected to see Audrey Hepburn on this list, but she merits inclusion. She was part of the Dutch resistance during World War II and helped raise money to help shelter, feed, and tend to downed Allied pilots to help them get through the Pyrenees Mountains and into Spain. Since she spoke fluent English, she took on more daring missions, and on one occasion, she had a close encounter with German soldiers when she was spotted in the forest having just dropped off a British flyer. As they approached her, she quickly picked up some wildflowers and presented them to the smitten soldiers, and after they checked her papers, they let her go. Every loyal Dutch schoolgirl and boy did their little bit to help during the war, said Audrey years later. Many were way more courageous than I was. So that's it for part 3. I'm sure there'll be a part 4. Leave your thoughts in the comments. You'll notice I'm holding a book. It's my first novel. It's based on many of the characters that we profiled over the last year, and I think you'll really, really enjoy it. More to come. Till next time, I'm Nick Ragone.